Hi, I'm Devin Stewart from the Carnegie Council. For more than 95 years, the Carnegie Council has been promoting ethics in international affairs. Please consider donating to our annual fund by going to carnegiecouncil.org and click on support. Thank you very much.
I think it's important to start out with a little bit of context. You know, Malcolm Gladwell, very well-known journalist here in New York, wrote a book called The Tipping Point. And in that book, he talks about how societies, industries, and other things change suddenly. And one of the important factors he said you had to understand in thinking about change, what was the context? What was going on in the background that led up to that? So let's talk about that for a second. Afghanistan, about the size of the state of Texas. Population's about 33 million people. Very dispersed as compared to Iraq. There are only 6 cities in Afghanistan that have a population over 100,000. If you took 25 of the major cities of Afghanistan, those 25 cities only encompass about 20% of the population. So unlike Iraq, where you have Baghdad, 7 million people, literally 1/4 of the Iraqi population in one single city. It's not the case here in Afghanistan. And so when you think about controlling this country and controlling the population, much more difficult proposition. Obviously, various tribes and groups. 2 largest are, of course, the Tajiks in the north, represented, in fact, in the election by Mr. Abdullah, who is a Tajik. And in the south by the Pashtuns. And Mr. Karzai, of course, is a Pashtun. And historically, let's just say relations between the Tajiks and the Pashtuns have never always been that polite or that hospitable. There are about 30 to 35 million Pashtuns living in Pakistan. There's about 15 million or so living in Afghanistan. For a Pashtun, this dividing line, this border between Afghanistan and Pakistan is pretty invisible as far as they're concerned. There's a lot of myths about Afghanistan. One is that it's ungovernable. Actually, if you go back to 1900 to about 1970 or so, it was pretty governable. It was a poor country. It had a monarchy. It was pretty decentralized, but fairly peaceful in comparison to a large portion of the Arab world at that time. Of course, in 1978, you had a Marxist revolution that deposed the king. One friend of mine who was a scholar of that said this Marxist revolution in Kabul was more like Groucho than Karl. But in any event, that did in fact occur and installed a Marxist government. That government requested the assistance of the Soviet Union, and of course you had the Soviet invasion of 1979. Since then, as we all know, Afghanistan has spiraled down into conflict either with opponents such as the Soviet Union or internal conflicts between various warlords or the Taliban for the last 30-odd years. Economically, Afghanistan competes with Somalia for last place in terms of overall economic development, and you have an illiteracy rate of about 70%. I was talking to a colleague of mine involved with training the Afghan army, and he said, think about this. You're trying to train an army to maintain at least modestly some advanced pieces of equipment, and you have to start with the fact that for the average Afghan, he has never seen a screwdriver in his life. So in terms of the training, that's where you're starting. 70% illiterate, and a screwdriver is a whole new thing, puts you at a different place in terms of that development. Very primitive in terms of infrastructure, transportation networks, and very remote. As a consequence, the United States is more and more dependent, and I'll talk about that in a bit, in terms of our resupply by passage through the Central Asian republics you see there, to include Kyrgyzstan, as well as overflight rights and now railway rights through the Russian Federation to resupply our forces in Afghanistan. Because up until recently, we were primarily dependent on resupply through Pakistan, about 75% of all resupply going through the Khyber Pass. Last but not least, of course, the importance of Pakistan here in the lower right-hand corner. As one colleague of mine put it, you know, we can lose this war in Afghanistan, but we can only win it in Pakistan. Because as we've seen over time, Al-Qaeda, also the Taliban's ability to use the tribal areas along the border to train, organize, equip, and then move back into Afghanistan to conduct more attacks.